Good morning. How are you? Good. It's great to be here. And what I'd like to talk about today are some ideas that I've been tinkering around on and really leading to this idea of what it's going to take to flourish in this incredibly hybrid world. Oops. Okay. So this is an image that went quite viral in December of 2020. It's an illustration by the comic book illustrator Adrian Tomine, and it's called Love Life. And in it, you can see a young woman who's on a virtual date. She has a cocktail in one hand and her smartphone device in the other. She has her laptop stacked on some books. Her floor is a mess. Actually, what I love about his work is that the more that you look at it, the more detail that you see. So for example, she hasn't shaved her legs. Behind her makeshift screen, her bed is unmade. Her sink is full of dirty dishes. The top of the refrigerator has some wine bottles, some open, some unopened. But the reason this matters to me is because it really captures the blurred boundaries in which we're all trying to navigate. Blurred boundaries between work and home, home and play, play and learning, learning and work. And in order to navigate those incredibly blurred boundaries, we need a new true north. We need a new way to navigate those blurred boundaries. And in my view, one of the ways to do that is through creativity. Now, we are now in year 3 of the pandemic, more or less. And we also started to see this trend that we talked about quite a lot in the United States, which is where I'm from. I'm from Philadelphia on the east coast of the United States. We started talking about something we're calling the Great Resignation or the Great Reshuffle. And I was really curious about what's behind this. My hypothesis was that the Great Reshuffle is a symptom. And I basically said, I'd love to talk to you if you have made a shift during this Great Reshuffle. And I ended up, this is still very early stages, I've ended up talking to about 15 people out of who responded to me. And some of the themes that I was hearing are things like, I want to be in a work environment where I am seen and heard. I want to be in a work environment where it's okay for me to have evidence of my home life, where I can work from home. At the same time, I was leaving some organizations not for better money, not to become an entrepreneur, but to really be in an environment where I could have the space and the time to integrate my work and my life. And I thought, well, this is interesting. And so I started experimenting even more with these ideas through my writing. So I published this article in Fast Company magazine about something I was calling invisible work. And I wasn't talking about the gendered invisible work, the invisible work that is usually talked about in terms of women's work that goes uncounted. The type of invisible work I was really interested in is what I've come to call gut up work. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, maybe I just need to stand over here. That would probably be smarter, right? The other thing I started experimenting with was this idea of solitude, which is very different than the isolation that we've been going through. So I published another article in Forbes magazine about why solitude is actually really important and essential to manage your business and to be a much more effective leader. So what I landed on is something that's still, I'm prototyping it, it's still very experimental, but is this trajectory towards flourishing. And what that trajectory looks like is that we're at the intersection of the 4th Industrial Revolution and the Great Reshuffle is this opportunity to flourish. And of course, the 4th Industrial Revolution, the train has left the station. It is this time where tech is ubiquitous. So surgical operations in hospitals are being done by robots. My Alexa app at home is a combination of AI and AR. If our children don't know the definition of words, they Google them, right? So this saturation of technology is very real, and there's going to be a lot of casualties because of that in terms of our work environments. But the upside, the silver lining, in my view, is that we can actually make more room for the human to show up. And so at the intersection of this fourth industrial revolution and the great reshuffle is this opportunity for flourishing, which is a bit different from the languishing that we've been hearing a lot about. It's kind of quite the opposite. This is another image from an article that came out at the beginning of the pandemic, around the fall of the pandemic, in the Harvard Business Review. And it was an interview with one of the world's leading experts on the topic of grief, a guy named David Kessler. And he was talking about how we typically think of grief in terms of 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, sadness/depression, and then finally acceptance. And what David Kessler said is actually there's a 6th stage of grief. And that 6th stage is purpose and meaning. And what I loved about his nailing this idea of we go not from this plateau of acceptance, but this uptick to purpose and meaning is that from my perspective, creativity is all wrapped up in the business of meaning making. And what it really means is that we have this opportunity for new metrics for productivity as we're navigating these blurred boundaries. Whoops. So some of those metrics that I've been experimenting with include the following: the ability to pause more, and incentivization to pause, to really find time for play, to lean into our intuition, to do incredibly embodied work, and to acknowledge that embodied work actually is the trigger for our highest cognitive functioning, and to really prioritize inquiry-based leadership, those who are able to lead with questions. So most of us have worked in environments where we've been rewarded for showing up to work from the chin up. And actually, a lot of the metaphors and models about the brain have been totally disembodied, right? It's been about brain as computer, brain as muscle. And maybe if we're lucky, we might get rewarded if we're showing up to work from the heart up. And now and then we might dabble in sharing a bit more in our work environments about what our heart is telling us to do. And that's okay, but that's not really leaning into the world of flourishing that I'm talking about. The world of flourishing that I'm talking about means that it's all about gut up work. And in my work as a creativity strategist, one of the things I'm getting increasingly interested in is the neuroscience of creativity. So all of us are hardwired with this human antenna of intuition. It's called the vagus nerve. It's the longest cranial nerve in our body. It extends from the brain down through the heart into the gut. And so literally when we say, my gut is telling me, it is. So this gut up work really is synchronized in the midst of this fourth industrial revolution where technology will take over basic tasks. We need to figure out ways to optimize this gut up work. So here's what I know to be true. In a world where we can now work from anywhere and we can learn from anywhere, those organizations, those leaders, and those teams that figure out ways for us to work at the intersection of these 3 things, technology, productivity, and meaningful human experience, will be the ones that thrive and flourish. Now, most of my clients have gotten 2 out of the 3 nailed. They are pretty good at productivity, and they're just trying to figure out which tech platform they should be using to optimize their productivity. Or they're a tech firm, and they're just trying to figure out how to be more productive. But what they haven't nailed is how do we integrate meaningful human experience into this equation? Meaningful human experience internally among us as colleagues, but also meaningful human experience in terms of the ways we are interacting and relating with our clients. Now, I'm a little biased, but in my view, creativity is the through line between all 3 of these dimensions. So the questions that really interest me are these 2 questions. Why should we be consistently integrating creativity into our work? And then how might we do that? So what I really want to land on in my remarks today is the how. But at first, a bit more about the why. We all have heard of IQ. Our parents were really excited when we tested with a decent IQ. And then we now know that there's something called EQ, our emotional intelligence. Well, I believe that now more than ever, it's also important for us to develop what I call a CQ, our creativity quotient. And our creativity quotient is really a new mental model. And this is how it works from my perspective. It really starts with gratitude, because gratitude is the portal into becoming a true systems designer. When we start with gratitude, we are so clear that we are not responsible for all of our accomplishments, for all the things that we have, for the environments that we are in. When we are grateful, we understand the interconnectedness among all of the nodes in this larger network of, dare I say, the universe. And once we are grateful, that leads to a level of humility, which is priceless. That humility helps to spark curiosity. In my workshop yesterday, we talked a bit about question shaming, and how the reason why so many of us aren't better at asking questions is that we experience these moments in our schooling or on the job where we got the signal very early, don't ask too many questions. We were either ignored, looked at like we had 3 heads, or even worse, maybe kind of snickered at, laughed at. So we learned very quickly, don't ask too many questions. But when we are humble, it's not about being the smartest person in the room. Questions are inputs into a system, and the more diverse the questions, the more innovative the output. So once we really master this ability to ask new and different questions, that is the precursor to empathy. Before you can empathize with the soul, you must be curious, and I'll talk about that a little more. And finally, ideally, empathy, the ability to understand what it's like to walk in another person's shoes, leads to action. This is the creativity quotient that we all have the opportunity to develop, starting with gratitude. Now, I've talked to a lot of audiences that might be a little, reticent to engage in this idea of creativity and how significant and relevant it is to the important stuff. So let me just share a few data points I've been collecting. The first data point comes from the World Economic Forum, which since 2015 has been ranking creativity as one of the top 10 job skills for 2020 and beyond. 1 year later, in 2016, they actually said, hang on, we actually think that creativity is not going to rank as the number 10 job skill, but the number 3 job skill for 2020 and beyond. Now, what's interesting to me is that job skills numbers 1 and 2 are critical thinking and problem solving, which PS is still creativity. So net, creativity is ranking as the number 1 job skill for 2020 and beyond. The next set of data points come from Stillcase, the furniture design company. And Stillcase's research learned that 55% of people want to be more creative in their work environments, but 19% of people are pointing to a lack of guidance or even permission to be creative. And then they broke down the data generationally, and they learned that 60% of millennials and centennials are showing a lot more creative ambition than older workers like me. I'm a solid Gen Xer. And then we can even see data from the financial services industry. So Fidelity Investments learn, again, generationally, that 58% of millennials are ranking the quality of their work environment over financial remuneration when they're evaluating a job offer. And then Degreed research has learned that 46% of people report they're a lot more likely to leave an employer if there's no commitment to upskilling and reskilling. And creativity is wrapped up all in the work of upskilling and reskilling. But some more recent research, which comes from WeTransfer, is also super interesting. As of 2020, WeTransfer research learned that 61% of people in new jobs are having a lot more creative ideas. This is at the start of the pandemic, so this is really interesting. 29% of people are feeling a little more creative than usual. And then 46% are reflecting on how to achieve purpose and fulfillment. Remember, David Kessler's 6th stage of grief, coming out of this pandemic. How do I get to more purpose, fulfillment, and meaning? So, what is creativity? I keep tossing that word around. I call myself a creativity strategist. You are totally within your right to ask, well, how the heck is she defining creativity? So glad you asked. So a lot of the time when I hear people reference creativity, especially in some corporate environments, I hear things like, oh, I'm not a creative type, or the creatives will take care of it, almost like lipstick on a pig. And they're typically talking about the design teams, the marketing advertising teams. And so what's happening is that a lot of the time when we think about creativity, we might be thinking of musicians, people who are skilled and gifted in music. Or we might be thinking of visual artists, and we have maybe a very idealized view of these visual artists, whiling away the afternoon with streams of sunlight shining down on them. Or perhaps we're thinking of dancers, people who are trained, skilled, and talented to tell story through movement. But if we are only thinking about artists when we think about creativity, we've lost the point, because we end up ghettoizing and siloing creativity in the arts, which is not fair to artists, and it's actually not beneficial to our society at large. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this. I landed on the following definition of creativity, and I wrote about it in a book called The Creativity Leap. That creativity is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems and produce novel value. And that value can be financial value, social value, cultural value. But if we begin to think about creativity in this way, then we begin to understand that the best lawyers, I'm married to one, accountants, farmers, teachers, coders, designers are super creative when they're toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. Now, if I can nerd out with you for a bit, creativity is actually rooted in complexity theory, in chaos theory. Creativity is what we can call a chaotic system. And a chaord is a word that a gentleman named D. Hock made up. D. Hock was the first president of Visa, the credit card company. Most of us have a Visa card in our wallet. And in the early 60s, he was tasked with leading Visa, which was brand new. And he thought, how the heck am I going to lead this global organization based on the virtual exchange of currency? And he was taking a walk through the woods and noticed that in nature, there's some chaos, which is not anarchy, it's randomness. And there's also some order, which is not control, it's structure. And he thought, what if I could design Visa in a way that was much more like, he did a mashup of the two words, a chaord. And the more one learns about chaotic systems, now there's a whole academic body of researchers, they have conferences on chaotic systems thinking, the more you see chaords everywhere. So you see them in nature. You see the order in terms of the way the woods have developed, but the randomness in terms of the individuality of each tree. The ways that our bodies heal are examples of chaotic systems. So if you skin your knee, there's not this permission slip linear process, but there's local, emergent, self-organizing, adaptive behavior at work. And jazz music is a phenomenal example of a chaotic system at work. Jazz musicians know music theory, they practice incessantly, their compositions have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's the order. And what happens in between that magic is the chaos. So you can see how influenced I've been by chaotic systems thinking. So that when I landed on this definition of creativity, wonder is that chaos dimension, and rigor is that order dimension. So what is wonder? And this is a little review for those of us who were in my workshop yesterday, but wonder is about deep curiosity and audacity and awe and pausing and big blue sky thinking. I remind people that it's kind of hard to wonder when you're going 80 miles an hour. You have to slow down. And a lot of intellectual heavy hitters have given a lot of credence to wonder. So Socrates said that wisdom begins in wonder. And then centuries later, the Jewish theologian and civil rights activist Abraham Heschel wrote that it's wonder rather than doubt, which is the root of all knowledge. So if we want to up the ante in our knowledge and in our wisdom, we must design space and time for wonder. Now, most of us stop at the wonder dimension when we're thinking about creativity. But the other dimension is rigor. And rigor is about focus, time on task, incessant practice, discipline, rigor is not particularly fun or sexy, and it's often very solitary. But if any of you have any background in the arts, you know how much rigor it takes practicing a musical instrument, learning to dance, how sweaty and how much minutia it takes, and how solitary it is before you can engage in the wonder. So Leonardo da Vinci, the original Renaissance man himself, said that any obstacle can be destroyed through rigor. So if we think about creativity in these ways, we realize that creativity is a productivity play. It is essential for productivity. It is fundamental for our well-being, because when we engage in this work around wonder, it actually releases those really positive hormones like serotonin, which is super important for our well-being. And it's a competency. It's something that we can get better at. It's something that we can exercise, and we can exercise our CQ. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to public radio, which is a thing in the United States. I'm not sure if it's a thing in other countries as much, but I was listening to an interview about a group of fifth graders, a group of 10-year-olds, who entered a podcast production competition. And that in itself was really cool, but here's the part that really made me perk up. The interviewer was asking the main teacher who was guiding the children through this group of 10-year-olds through their podcast production, and one of the things the teacher observed is that this is a generation that values two things: anonymity and connectivity. I thought, wow, that's so interesting. And of course, I'm a frameworks nerd, so I'm like thinking, that's an interesting 2x2. Anonymity on the one hand, and connectivity on the other. The reason this really matters is that as we are preparing work environments and trying to recruit really cool and interesting people to work with us, we need to think about how do we align with their ways of being productive, of what's the intersection between having high connectivity but also high anonymity. And on a boat ride a couple of days ago, we were talking about this, and someone was sharing about how their child is really into Minecraft through Twitch. That's the perfect example of this intersection between high anonymity and connectivity, which made me think about what are the ways that technology like that can help us to flourish and help younger people coming up to flourish. Well, that led me to think about very new sorts of KPIs for flourishing. I'm going to go through this quickly as a list of questions. If we think about the types of people that we want to have in our work environments, we need to ask, well, who are we hiring? How do we hire? How are we connecting and designing teams? And how might things like technology actually prompt pausing and stepping away from the laptop? In terms of the processes that we use, how can we incentivize creativity? How can we reframe our business models? How could and what if we normalized play so that it wasn't just a nice to have, but it was actually a must have in the ways that we work? And in terms of our environments, how could we redesign our offices and the home? Remember those blurred boundaries. And what if those blurred boundaries, we were actually exploring the benefits? And what if sensorial and emotional design became more mainstreamed, especially if we begin to accept gut up work? Well, here are the mindsets that will increasingly matter in not the far off future of work, but the near off future of work. And these mindsets require 3 shifts in our mental model. So I've already talked about the wonder rigor paradigm, which is okay, but how do you actually operationalize creativity? How do you institutionalize it and make it a part of the ways that we work? Well, I came out with a new framework called the 3 I's. And the 3 I's are inquiry, improvisation, and intuition. So what I want to share now, as I'm coming to a close, are some really tactical and practical ways that we can operationalize creativity for those questions that I listed in those new KPIs in order to flourish. These are the mindsets and the shifts that will matter. The first shift in our mental models that we have to make is a shift away from certainty to curiosity. Now, I'm a board member at a really cool organization called Leadership and Design. And one of the mottos of leadership and design is to be more curious than certain. Before I go into what it takes to be more curious than certain, let me take a step back to the E word, to empathy. So many leaders of major companies have been talking about empathy, empathy, empathy since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So for example, Frederick Furt, who's the chief innovation evangelist at Google, has said things like empathy is the skill of the future. And I agree with him. Empathy is the skill of the future, but there's a step before empathy. Before you can empathize with the soul, you must be curious. You must have the ability to frame new and different questions, like, why do they do it that way and not our way? How come? Why do they sit over there and not over here? If you don't even have the capacity to ask the question, you actually can never be truly curious. So in my view, curiosity is the precursor to empathy, and it is the currency of our future. So now that I've kind of laid the table about why curiosity is so important, let's define it a bit more. Ian Leslie has a terrific book called Curious, in which he defines curiosity as the product of an information gap. You need to know just a little bit about something to be curious. And my friend and colleague Warren Berger talks about how curiosity is actually a way of thinking. And in his view, we should be teaching question asking in schools. We shouldn't just assume that we all know how to ask really great questions. And our friend Daniel Stillman, who I think is here, has been leading great workshops all about asking questions. So Ray Dalio, who's the co-founder of the hedge fund Bridgewater, has a very unorthodox way of leading. He likes to record every single room. He's really aiming for radical transparency. But I like what he said here. He said that great questions are a much better indicator of future success than great answers. Another reason why we have to really lean into curiosity. So how do you become better at inquiry? Here's a couple of ways. Number one, you must insist on creative abrasion teams. So if you're a design team, as in the case of Jerry Hirschberg, who is the head of design at Nissan, and he made up this term, he would always make sure that whenever his design team was going through a design challenge, he would make sure that they invited people from finance, HR, manufacturing, sales. Now, most of us bristle at the idea of having to collaborate with people who don't have our training, don't have our perspectives, our experience. We're going to waste so much time having to break down things for them. But what he understood is that that friction, that abrasion, actually, at the end of the day, culminates in energy. So why not convert that energy into something positive? So what I recommend that you all do is to figure out ways to, maybe baby steps, just one person who you add into the mix, who will challenge your jargon, who will ask the naive child questions at the beginning, middle, and end of your work processes. The second thing that I recommend that you do is to start leading with questions. Now, leading with questions does not look like the following. Okay, guys, give me your best questions. I'm all ears. You probably will be met with kind of deer in the headlights or crossed arms. No one really wants to venture and ask a question. So how do you start? Well, to lead with inquiry, you have to be transparent and vulnerable and share the questions that you yourself, through self-inquiry, are beginning to have about a process. You have to be transparent and share how you're beginning to rethink this marketing strategy. You know that group over there, that company over there that we thought were our competitors? I'm wondering, what if we call them up and try to meet with them and maybe forge a co-opetition sort of relationship? When you, as a leader, an emerging leader, an established leader, begin to share more transparently the questions that you have, that models the behavior for others to begin to ask those questions. And so I'm going to end each of my tactics with a question for you, which is this one for inquiry. How might you design experiences that spark more questions than answers? And if you were at my workshop yesterday, you had some tips on that. The second shift in our mental model that we have to make is a shift away from planning to improvising. Now, improvisation, as I've already said, is a complex system. It's a chaotic system. And it's all about being adaptive, experimental, saying yes and, definitely not yeah, but, and certainly not a flat out no. A lot of the times, whoops, okay. I put up this slide, and in some audiences, I literally can see people breaking out into hives when I say, plans are fiction. What? What do you mean plans are fiction? Here's why plans are fiction. They haven't happened yet, okay? The budget you've been developing, my daily to-do list. I mean, I like a good plan like anybody else, but when I realize that plans are fiction because they haven't happened yet, I approach my work and my day in a much more adaptive manner. And here's the great news. You actually improvise every single day. I bet that between breakfast and lunch on a daily basis, you've had to hack your way through supporting a spouse, a child, a colleague, or a client. And in fact, as children, we were phenomenal hackers. We were constantly hacking our play. So don't be intimidated by this idea of improvisation. Improvisation is not only for the fabulous jazz musicians of the world, or the rap artists like Jay-Z, or those great comedic artists on Saturday Night Live. All of us have this ability to improvise. And also, I deliberately put this statement on this photograph, which I love. In the United States of America, not every group of children have access to really nice playgrounds. So some have to hack their play, and this is a group of kids. They wanted to play basketball. They took an old milk crate, punched out the bottom, and had the nerve to hang it below a sign that says, no ball playing. I love their audacity. So if you want to get better at improvising, I probably don't need to tell you guys this, but prototype more and encourage your organizations to prototype. Prototypes, as we know, don't have to just be tangible objects, but to engage them in more doodling. That's a prototype. And more pop-ups of experiences and services. And on a personal level, try becoming a clumsy student of anything. Right now, I'm a clumsy student of ballroom dance. I've studied dance since I was about 4 years old, started studying modern dance, got to jazz and hip hop as a high school student, college student. And as you get older, and you don't dance full time, it's kind of hard to keep it up, but I love to dance. So I'm a clumsy student of all forms of ballroom. And one of the great things about you becoming a clumsy student of, I don't know, poker, auto mechanics, gardening, whatever it is, you actually begin to get really good at all three I's, at inquiry, at improvisation, and at intuition. So become a clumsy student of something. And here's the question I leave you with. How might you design experiences that can improvise community, especially in this very blurred boundary work world that we are living in? The final shift is to shift away from only focusing on what's rational to embracing our intuition. Now, I've already shared that intuition is something that we're hardwired with through the vagus nerve in our body, right? But how do we define intuition? I define intuition as pattern recognition. That sense that I should go left and not right, that I should work with her and not him, even though her resume isn't as spiffy and impressive. The other way I think about intuition is brain feelings. And some people think of intuition as that knowing without knowing. When I wrote The Creativity Leap, as I was writing The Creativity Leap, I interviewed over 50 people who come from a range of sectors. And here we see some people from NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, a couple who owns a 5-acre fruit farm, a nose, a perfume who's smelling my arm. She toggles between chemistry and intuition. Every single leader talked about the role of intuition in their strategic decision making. In fact, I'll never forget the interview with Biplab Sarkar. He's a PhD in electrical engineering. He's the CEO of a technology firm. And I was really nervous when I started to have to ask him about, please share some stories with me about how you use your intuition. Because I thought he would laugh me out the room. He's an engineer. He heads this tech firm. And I was totally wrong. And he started to share all these stories of how he incorporates his intuition, his internal sense-making with the quantitative data. And we have to share those stories more openly with our colleagues. So, to become better at intuiting, try documenting or journaling about the last 3 times you did follow the nudge. What was the result? And then document or journal about the last few times you ignored the nudge, and what was the result? And be really vocal and honest and upfront about the ways you're integrating your intuition into your strategic decision making. And here's my question I leave you with. How might you design many more intuitive experiences internally for your colleagues and externally on a client-facing basis? So these are the 3 I's. Go forth and use them well. I have a gift for you if you're interested. It's called the Wonder Rigor Tip Sheet, and it's 16 ways that you can amplify both wonder and rigor in your life and your work. And for all those who choose to download this tip sheet, we will choose one lucky person who will receive a signed copy of the Creativity Leap. So in addition to getting some tips, you might get a signed copy of the book. I want to leave you with a short reflection. About 10 years ago, I read this incredible novel by the British-Pakistani writer Mohsin Hamid. It's called How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia. Now, not only is the book phenomenal because he's written entirely in the second person, so the protagonist says you, so you have this really intimate connection through the story. But a year after I read the book, I was listening to public radio, and the author was being interviewed. And he talked about how his first draft of this book was totally rejected. And he was crestfallen, and he put the book aside for like 6 months. And then he perked himself up again, he took all the corrections, he rewrote it, he submitted it, and it became this phenomenal novel. But the thing that he said that stuck with me is that he said, I mistook the cocoon for the butterfly. And what he meant by that is, I thought I was done. I thought that first draft was the butterfly, but that first draft was the cocoon. So as we're preparing ourselves personally, our work environments for this future of work, let's not mistake the cocoon for the butterfly. Let's not get infatuated with the technology and forsake the opportunity to see the ways that the tech can optimize the ways we show up to work more fully human and, dare I say, creative, so that we can truly flourish at work. Thank you so much.